Good evening, all, and welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. Tonight we are talking about Kant and the moral science. So let's jump right into it. We are starting off with a Kantian essay entitled, prepare yourselves, Was ist Aufklärung? Because everything in German sounds better when it's loud and angry. What this means is, what is enlightenment? And Kant is going to answer this in a single word. He's going to say enlightenment is freedom. And so let's see kind of how he gets there. Kant is going to close out the Enlightenment period, and he's going to ask some very important questions. Questions like, what can I know? So that would be our problem of knowledge. What I to do, our problem of conduct. And finally, what can I hope? But in this what is enlightenment question, he's kind of taken a different approach to things. His answer is that enlightenment is synonymous with intellectual freedom, with expressing our own authentic ideas, not just echoing someone else's ideas. Enlightenment, he says, is our emergence from our self-incurred immaturity. And all that we really need to do this is freedom. And so this is the freedom to make public use of our private reason. What would something like that look like? So here's the thing. We've said that the Enlightenment is this period of time from 1596, the birth of Descartes, to 1804, the death of Kant. In this 208-year period, excuse me, the reason it cuts off with the death of Kant is because he's sometimes referred to as a Shiva figure. Shiva, if you're familiar with Hindu mythology, is the creator and the destroyer. And so he's kind of the culmination of Enlightenment thought. He brings it to his highest point ever. But as he does this, he kind of sets rational limits on the whole Enlightenment project and kind of destroys the thing accidentally as well. Now, the Enlightenment values, there are personal values and political implications of these. So the personal values, reason over religion, skepticism over faith, individualism over community, and the political implications really are going to lean towards the natural rights of individuals, the notion that sovereignty rests with the people, and the creation of the nation state. Now, in his Critique of Pure Reason, Kant is going to credit his skeptical contemporary David Hume with waking him from his dogmatic slumbers. Hume had already said that everything that we know comes from experience. And he kind of gave us that idea of a causal relationship that we ought to be looking at in the world. Kant is also going to be influenced by Thomas Reid's common sense philosophy. So the critique takes up these challenges. And when we say a critique in philosophy, we don't mean a polemic or a broadside or attack against this, but rather, what can we know using only our rational resources? So in his first critique, and the second one, the Critique of Pure Reason, the second one's a Critique of Practical Reason, and the third, the Critique of Judgment, which is actually about aesthetics, Kant agrees with Hume in saying all of our knowledge arises first in the experience of the world around us. But he says there's a fundamental distinction to be made. Just because it arises from experience doesn't mean that it's grounded in experience. If we recall Hume's theory of causal concepts, we regard A as the cause of B when A and B have been constantly conjoined in our experience, and we associate them. That's not the conclusion of an argument, that's just the habit of our minds. We get used to thinking that way. Now, as Kant thinks of this, cognitive or epistemic holdings that aren't the result of our experience, that is stuff we know that we didn't see it, taste it, touch it, hear it, smell it, and so on, he's going to refer to those as pure, so non-empirical, okay? The Critique of Pure Reason, he's critically examining the forms of rationality that couldn't have come from experience, but make up the framework within which all of those experiences are possible. So how do we get there? So the only way that experience is possible is in a couple of necessary preconditions, time and space. So Kant reaches the concept of pure, that is non-empirical, intuitions of time and space. And he uses that word intuitions to mean a precondition for something else to come about. So these are things that we call a priori, prior to experience, for them to work. So Kant argues there's something kind of lacking in Hume's account of knowledge and experience. Again, if all knowledge arises out of experience, it's not necessarily grounded in experience. So Kant is trying to give us a framework within which we can know things. And he says, in all instances, knowledge involves a judgment. And we form this within a universal categorical framework that I can't necessarily gain by experience. And so he's going to give us 4 categories of understanding. And here they are. So he's got categories of quantity. This is going to include like unity, plurality, totality. Unity 1, plurality more than 1, totality, all of them. Categories of quality, reality, negation, and limitation. It does exist, it doesn't exist, it stops at this point. Categories of modality, possibility, existence, necessity. It could exist, it does exist, it must exist. And categories of relation, inherence, causality, community, and correlation. Those are fairly obvious. Okay? Certain of these categories we can get by experience, such as there is a unity of cups here. But nothing in our experience gives totality or necessity. We can know unity, we can know plurality, nothing gives us totality, and yet we know, without counting all of them, that there's an infinite number of integers. In other words, you could start counting now and you would never run out of numbers to count. Likewise, nothing in the world of sensible matter can be known to be necessarily the case. Anything could be imaginably different. So, instead of the sky being blue, it could conceivably be purple or red or green or whatever else you like. Sorry for the screeching, the recycling truck is picking up outside. So experience only leads us to inferences of greater or lesser probability. Certain things seem more or less likely, but they can't give us certainty. But even those inferences, really we can only understand them within the framework of necessity. That is, something's probable only to the extent that it's not necessary. Now, if we were beings of a different sort, would our categories be different? No. They don't have anything to do with what kind of thing we are. They're prerequisite conditions that are placed on any type of knowledge or anything that we can experience. And so the pure categories are the necessary forms of knowledge. Now, Kant is getting into claims that Hume's wrong to say that no synthetic propositions can be known to be true a priori, only analytic ones. What do we mean by these terms? An analytic proposition is one where the subject term and the predicate term are essentially the same thing. They're synonymous. All bachelors are unmarried men. All widows are women whose husbands have died. Okay, so the truth of analytic propositions is known a priori, so prior to experience. You don't have to know any bachelors, you don't have to know any widows, you just need to know the definitions. A synthetic proposition is a factual statement about items and events in the world. Steve is wearing shoes, okay? So you gotta know who Steve is, you gotta know what shoes are, and you have to have mastered the concept of what it is to wear something. Okay, so in Hume's epistemology, no synthetic proposition can be known to be true except by way of experience. That is, a posteriori. Okay, here's how Kant kind of rebuts this idea. Okay, every experience that you're ever going to have, so I'm going to make a prediction for you right now. Every experience you will ever have will take place in intuitive frameworks of space and time. All of the knowledge claims that I'm going to make are going to match up with those categories of quantity, quality, modality, and so on. So every empirical statement we could ever possibly make will have certain properties that can be established a priori. So what this means is we can make synthetic statements whose truth is known a priori. Your stuff is going to happen to you somewhere and some when. Okay? Now, forms of knowledge, kind of like forms of experience, aren't themselves given an experience, but what they do is they determine the order, the organization, and the pattern of all of the knowledge that results from them. So in a manner of speaking, in order for Hume to be right, Kant has to be right. Okay? The Kantian a priori framework is required for Hume's account of causation and knowledge to work on the face of it. When Kant is saying Hume's right a little bit to say that knowledge comes from experience, he's kind of being an empiricist himself. But he's also stating his position is kind of following Thomas Reid, okay? So think for just a minute about the world known versus the world knowable, okay? Have you ever actually received a Big Mac that looks like the picture on Big Mac advertisements? I have, in fact. In Tokyo, Japan, they take such pride in their work and are so immaculate in their preparation that the Big Macs actually look like the picture. It's cool. You know, you can get a filet-o-fish over there, and instead of, you know, the cheese being barely on the patty and somehow wrapped under the bun, I don't even know how they do that. It's actually placed perfectly on there. So what we know of the external world factually takes the form of phenomena. Phenomena. Sorry. Okay. The question is, how accurately does my mental representation of reality actually reflect reality? I know when I go to McDonald's, which is not that often, that the Big Mac I receive is probably going to look nothing like the picture. And yet I'm satisfied-ish when I get what I get. So Kant makes a distinction between phenomena, that's the realm that's here, and the realm beyond experience, which he calls the noumena, the thing as it really is. The phenomena, I'm not going to do it again, is the experience it creates in us as percipients, but it might not be the thing as it really is. What I know is confined to those categorical frameworks because all elements of understanding are located in them. Reason, though, can step outside of them. It's not limitless, but it can go a bit further. There's a lot of Hume in Kant and very little Kant in Hume. But in Kant, what we get is we start to see this rationalist critique of a systematic and relentless empiricism, and it looks a lot like Kant's first critique. Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about the moral science. Now, if we go back to Hume, Hume had said that we judge things as good and bad, not on some abstract external moral reality, but rather on how we feel about it. So Hume's moral theory is coming out of his empiricistic epistemology. That is, how he thinks about things is going to be how he has sensed them. He sees them, tastes them, touches them, hears them, and so on. So if we solve the problem of knowledge in favor of these impressions and ideas, moral issues we can kind of collapse into things about impressions and ideas. So he says, since morals therefore have an influence on the actions and affectations, it follows they cannot be derived from reason. And because reason alone, as we have already proved, can never have such an influence. Morals excite passions and produce or prevent actions. Reason of itself is utterly impotent in this regard. The rules of morality, therefore, are not conclusions of our reason, end quote. Now, the principal adversary to later versions of utilitarianism and as a form of moral theories kind of follow after Kant's deontological theories, okay? Central to the deontological idea is the idea that it takes the imperative of certain moral precepts to be unconditional. Imperatives are those things that you gotta do, like, or unless you're gonna risk consequences. That is, an action is right or wrong under all possible circumstances, no matter the consequence. There may be some problems there. Deontological moral theories are opposed to utilitarian ones, the idea that all we're interested in is the consequences. So Kant's going to accept this kind of scientific conception of human nature, but he's going to reject the idea that we're just physiological organisms reacting to things. So in addition to occupying this natural realm, Kant says we also occupy the intelligible realm. In the intelligible realm, we account for events not just by looking at physical causes, but by examining reasons. And we understand the course of action in the intelligible realm by understanding the reasons that have guided that action. So, the other feature to this is an autonomy of the will. In Greek, auto means self, nomos means law, autonomous means self-lawed, self-ruled, self-guided, self-governed. If our actions were entirely determined by our physical constitutions, they would just be reactions. So that's Hume's position. Autonomy, though, we have to make any moral judgments. So Kant says we arrive at this idea of freedom because we've got this intuitive, or we might say innate, in natus, born into us, rational awareness of this universal moral law. And how we understand that is rational, not empirical. That is to say, we don't see it, taste it, touch it, hear it, or smell it. Now, it seems kind of contradictory to say things like laws of freedom, but only because we think of laws in a scientific sense of kind of determinism. If we're talking about a morally autonomous person, I'm going to turn you a little bit so I can see my screen better. You're governed by the freedom that of the laws that you give yourself. So the reason to act in one way or another, says Kant, are hypothetical imperatives versus categorical imperatives. So what are these things? If the choice of one alternative over another is to get a specific outcome or consequence or goal or end, it's a hypothetical imperative. They're tied to a particular context. So you are enrolled in this course as a hypothetical imperative. You're taking the class to get the grade, to get the degree, to get the job, to get the money, to get whatever it is that you're going to get, okay? And they're tied to your needs, your desires, your need to survive, to avoid pain, to gain pleasure, whatever. Decisions that are grounded this way, Kant says, are not moral because they arise from our natures not as rational beings, but simply as human beings. They're just reactions, okay? Categorical imperative, on the other hand, declares that an action is morally necessary in and of itself without any reference to any further purpose. Morality then starts with a rational and autonomous being in the intelligible realm where we're called on to have reasons for our actions. We've got to find some rule or precept or principle or something that's going to guide our actions, and that could be universal. In other words, that every other person in every other place at every other time likewise has to behave this way. So the categorical imperative isn't tied to any kind of desire or impulse or motive. It's got its own moral authority. And it's not contingent on the facts of the world. So moral maxims, kind of rules, reasons for acting, become applicable in every situation that generically is that given kind of action might take. This categorical imperative then isn't tied to our particular desires or impulse or motives. It's independent of consequences entirely. The authority is contained within the maxim itself, okay? Now, John Stuart Mill believes that this is potentially a license to do terrible things. As Kant's pure categories of understandings don't give content, just a rational and categorical framework, that's going to govern our possibility of understanding. Kant says we act in such a way that the maxim of our action, the rule guiding it, if we were able to, could be instituted as a universal law. This doesn't have to be world-changing stuff. Think of things that everyone, everywhere, always ought to do. Smile, recycle, say please and thank you, use your freaking turn signal, take your shopping cart back to the little thingy and put it away instead of wedging it up on the sidewalk. Sorry, rant over. What troubles Mill is this idea that, let's say you're an arsonist, and you get the greatest and most sincere pleasure of burning stuff down. Well, you could wish to install that as a categorical imperative that everybody else join you in. And he seems to be missing the point, or at the very worst, not understanding it very well. So a bad end or something that was selfish in nature would kind of imply in this context that not everybody should do that. And so Kant kind of avoids that. Now, Kant offers another version of the categorical imperative. People are never merely a means to an end, but always an end unto themselves. Now, to use another person in this way as a means to an end is to deny them their autonomy. Do we do this all the time? Yes, of course, unavoidably. You are using me for my knowledge of philosophy. I am using you for your kind payment of tuition. We're both using each other in this way. Now, that being said, we're not using each other in a negative or derogatory way. To treat others as a means to an end would mean that we qualify for the same treatment. Abraham Lincoln said, as I would not be a slave, neither would I be a master. Okay, so Kant's famous for concluding from this kind of line of reasoning that we must never lie. Now, do we lie? Sure. Are we likely to lie? Yeah. Are we probably going to continue to lie? You betcha. And yet, we should try not to lie in such a way that it's going to rob someone else of their autonomy. Kant's epitaph, that's the thingy on his tombstone, really kind of summarizes a lot about him, and it's brilliantly eccentric. I love it. The starry sky above him, the moral law within him. Kant gives us moral law not just to seek pleasure or avoid pain, but as a way of doing the right thing. And by extension, kind of substantiating ourselves as moral beings. So Kant's got a lot of cool things to tell us. He may not be right. He may be kind of an innocent. He's kind of an ivory tower academic. And yet he's giving us a good way of looking at things, or at the very least of kind of checking ourselves to make sure that that we are doing the right thing and that we have a possibility for moving forward with a little bit more of a theory then, because it seems to be the right thing to do. So that's all we've got for this evening. As always, if you've got questions, put them down in the comments, post them on the discussion, and I will look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.